So now I want to move on to the legacy of Medgar Evers. Um, that, like I said earlier when I first started this live stream, Medgar Evers is the person who I want to talk about today, and he was a very influential figure in the civil rights movement in the 1950s and it's in the early 60s before his assassination, which I'm going to get to in a second. But Medgar Evers was born on July the 2nd, 1925 in Decatur, Mississippi. Decatur, Mississippi. And that's where Mississippi is where he did most of his activism work. And he would eventually enlist in the army, I want to say, but I could be wrong about that. But he would eventually enlist in the armed forces, and he actually fought in World War II. And I didn't even know about this, but was doing some research before the show, and his unit was actually part of the invasion of Normandy in 1944. I don't think he was involved in the actual D-Day, like the actual storming of Normandy, but his unit was there literally the day after Normandy, the day after D-Day. And so I thought that was very interesting. And I believe he enlisted when he was 19 years old. And after he left the military, he was honorably discharged. And after he left the military, he made his way back to Mississippi. And like I said, he was instrumental in the civil rights movement throughout the 50s and the early 60s. And in 1954, after the Supreme Court decision in the Brown versus Board of Education, he was made the field secretary of the NAACP. So he was basically the lead organizer for the NAACP in Mississippi. And from 1954, over the course of about 3 years, he grew the membership of the NAACP to 15,000 from 1954 to basically since I think he joined December of 1954, if that data that I came across is accurate. So it was basically 1954 to 1958, but it wasn't a literal 4 years. But basically between that time period, he grew the membership, to 15,000 people. So he was very active in the community. And after the 1954 ruling, the Supreme Court ruling in Brown versus Board of Education, he spent the rest of his life fighting to enforce desegregation after that ruling, because there was a lot of resistance among the white supremacist crowd as they tried to figure out ways to maintain the racial status quo. So not only did he fight to enforce desegregation, such as, at Ole Miss, the University of Mississippi, where he would actually apply for membership, or he tried to get into Ole Miss. But, so there was resistance, because a lot of people think that after a lot of these rulings happen, like Brown versus Board of Education, there's just this groundswell and sweeping, reform across the nation. It doesn't really happen like that. You get a lot of local and state officials that sue and try to kick the can down the road and try to prolong progress as much as possible. And this happened all throughout history after that ruling occurred. This is why the military and the National Guard had to be sent in to protect black people who were going into white schools and things like that, because there was a lot of resistance. A lot of people refused to allow desegregation to actually go into effect. And so that was one of the main things Medgar Evers was fighting for, or fighting against, I should say. But that wasn't the only thing. So he was instrumental in the early fight for voting rights. And he also staged economic boycotts. Some people might not know this. One of Medgar Evers, one of his first assignments after being made the. After being made the field secretary in 1954, one of his first assignments was to investigate the murder of Emmett Till, okay, who was killed, probably not even a full year later. Emmett Till was killed in 1955 in Money, Mississippi, in a little small town called Money, Mississippi, or called Money in Mississippi. And it was Medgar Evers and two other field workers, a woman by the name of Ruby Hurley and Amzie Moore. They tracked down potential witnesses to the events leading up to and including Till's abduction. They convinced several people to come forward, keeping them in protective custody when they testified at the 1955 trial of two men, or of the two men accused of killing Till. And then after the trial was over, they shepherded them out of town in secrecy when the all-white jury returned a verdict of not guilty after deliberating for get this, 1 hour. So you had an all-white jury deliberate for an hour, and surprise, surprise, they came back with a not guilty verdict. Okay, so it was Medgar Evers who got those people, who found those witnesses and got them to take the stand against those terrorists, which is basically what those men were. And so he was instrumental in that. Now, obviously, it didn't end the way he would have wanted, but, he didn't have control over that. Now, sadly, in 1963, Evers was assassinated by a white supremacist who I refuse to name because, quite frankly, his name is not important. And this assassin, this white supremacist terrorist, this white identity extremist, was a member of a terrorist group. They're not officially recognized as that. But I say that specifically because of what this group, known as the White Citizens Council, what these people advocated. And what some of their members actually did. It is important, I think, for us to change the dialogue about these white supremacist groups. A lot of these groups are not labeled as terrorist groups. And that's done, in my opinion, this is my belief, that's done essentially as a way of protecting some of these groups to allow them to continue to exist. Okay, so if you treat these groups as terrorist entities, they aren't really allowed to exist because there are anti-terrorism laws that make it so that these groups, a lot of these groups, if they were labeled terrorists, they wouldn't exist in this country. So by just calling them hate groups, you kind of allow them to, the legacy to not really be accurately described, and I have a huge problem with that. Okay, the White Citizens Council was a terrorist organization. Okay, they were formed after the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education ruling, and they were formed specifically to oppose integration. It took 31 years to bring Evers's killer to justice because he was protected in two separate trials by, once again, all-white juries in 1964, which resulted both times in hung juries. So these all-white juries couldn't come to any sort of agreement. So this man was allowed to live for 3 decades up until 1954, when he was eventually found guilty. He was allowed to live as a free man for 3 damn decades after killing a instrumental figure in the civil rights struggle. Okay, the terrorist who killed Medgar Evers was also involved in a separate plot in the late 70s to kill another man. But this man was Jewish, the Jewish director of the Anti-Defamation League. So the same terrorist who killed Medgar Evers would later in the 70s go on to try to plot the assassination of another figure, and this man, this Jewish man, was also involved in the civil rights movement, but he, like I said, he was also in the ADL. So he spent like, I want to say 3 years in prison from like 1977 to 1980, or it might have been 4 years, 1977 to 1981. So, he wasn't able to get away with that plot. They discovered, the plot was spoiled basically before he was able to kill this Jewish director. But it just goes to show you that he should have never gotten away with the assassination of Medgar Evers. But because of who he was, and because of, him being protected by these juries, by these white supremacist juries, he was allowed to potentially kill someone else. And in 1994, he was eventually found guilty. He went to prison, and he died in 2001. So that is the very short, brief story of Medgar Evers and his legacy. And he was very instrumental early in the civil rights movement. After his assassination, there was a march that Martin Luther King was involved in. And his wife has kept up the fight. His wife has kept up the struggle since his murder. And she's still alive, and I'm very supportive of her and of her family. Now, before I end this stream, I want to very briefly talk to you about this White Citizens Council, because I called this organization a terrorist organization for a reason. Okay, because I don't use this word lightly, but I use this word specifically for groups like this. Okay, these devils, if we are to call them that, and I think if you're going to call anybody a devil, you would call white supremacist terrorist devils. Okay, they routinely incited acts of violence against black people. Okay, they advocated for lynchings, they advocated for shootings, they advocated for rapes and arson. These were not simply people who advocated for white people. Okay, these were people who went out of their way to say we should do acts of violence against black people to make sure that we don't have any sort of progressive equality in this country. They were loosely affiliated with the KKK, but they tried to portray themselves as being sort of the quote upper class of white supremacists. So they tried to redefine themselves and try to pretend. You remember how when it came to Richard Spencer, and how I believe it was the New York Times that tried to, or it might have been one of these other platforms that tried to portray Richard Spencer as the dapper white supremacist. That's sort of what the White Citizens Council tried to do in the 60s. They tried to portray themselves as the quote dapper or upper class good white supremacists. Okay, but they were just white terrorists, white supremacist terrorists, like the KKK were. They were no different. And I'm not going to go deep into their terroristic history, but you can do your own research on them, because I'm not going to spend too much time on them. If you want to know more about them, you can find information online. But their influence started waning in the 70s, and they were eventually replaced by a group called the Council of Conservative Citizens, which was founded in 1985 or 1988, depending on what information you're looking at. And a white supremacist by the name of Jared Taylor is a spokesman for this group. You might have heard of him, you might not have heard of him. But he is currently affiliated with this group, the Council of Conservative Citizens. And you might have heard of this group after Dylan Roof murdered those innocent black people in the Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, because Dylan Roof got a lot of his information, he got a lot of his white supremacist rhetoric from the Council of Conservative Citizens. And the Council of Conservative Citizens is basically an offshoot of the White Citizens Council. Okay, so what you'll find is you'll find that these white supremacist organizations are loosely affiliated. The White Citizens Council was loosely affiliated with the KKK, and the Council of Conservative Citizens is loosely affiliated with the White Citizens Council. And all sorts of Republican politicians have taken money from this group. Ted Cruz, Scott Walker, Tom Cotton, and yes, even Mia Love. Surprise, surprise. You know, the black female Republican serving Utah's 4th District in the House of Representatives. So don't be fooled by these organizations that try to rebrand themselves and try to sort of whitewash their white supremacist history. Because if you dig deep enough, you'll find that they are affiliated and they have membership and members who are affiliated with virulently white supremacist groups that, like I said before, should be labeled as terrorist organizations because of what they advocate. These are groups that historically advocate for violence against the black community. Some of them are smart not to do that nowadays. So, which is why they rebrand themselves, which is why you have the Council of Conservative Citizens, because they realized that in the 80s, they realized they needed to distance themselves from groups like the White Citizens Council, because the White Citizens Council in the 60s literally used to advocate for violence and acts of terrorism against black people. So, you know, every once in a while, they'll go like a snake that changes its skin. They'll put on a new skin. They'll jump in a new skin and rebrand themselves. And you have a lot of foolish people who fall for this and try to say, well, no, they're not violent. They just have problematic rhetoric. They just have these problematic views. You know, that you can't equate what they say with anything else. They have their free speech. You know, they have their First Amendment rights. Yet and still, you see these people. You see who they support. The money they get behind, the money they put behind politicians, and what these politicians are doing. These are a lot of these same politicians are the same politicians that are looking the other way with Donald Trump and with the white supremacists who have been and are currently in his administration. All of this shit is connected. Well, I said I wasn't going to curse, and I just cursed. So I failed miserably at that. But y'all see, this stuff gets me heated, and I get really animated when I start talking about these people who are a threat to our existence. So, like I said, this was a sort of a Debbie Downer live stream because I talked about two people who died fighting the struggle. But I wanted to talk about this because stuff like this is hard to talk about, but it needs to be talked about because people need to know. And I think people who routinely do this work know this, but a lot of people who are sitting on the sidelines, a lot of people who don't want to get involved, a lot of people who kind of think that they can just opt out of the black community and just act like that they can just pretend that they aren't black and they can just do their own thing. They need to be reminded about the people who have been and who are putting their lives on the line for them in the past and in the present. I can't pronounce his name. Muhyiddin Moye, the Moyes of the black community, and the Medgar Everses of the black community from the past. Nobody has what they have today, especially black and brown people, and even well, I'm not going to go there. I was going to bring something up, but I'm not going to go there. Basically, all non-white people, regardless of your ethnicity, everybody owes what they have in terms of their freedom to civil rights activists like Medgar Evers. And Martin Luther King, obviously, of course, but Medgar Evers too. And other people like him. And I think a lot of people forget that. I think a lot of people think that they can enjoy the freedoms that they have, that other people have worked for, without giving those people credit. And I have a problem with that. I have a huge problem with that. Whether you want to talk about Medgar Evers, whether you want to talk about Black Panthers, a lot of the original members of the Black Panther Party are still sitting in prison as political prisoners to this day. And the ones who aren't sitting in prison as political prisoners they're struggling. They're struggling to pay their bills. They're struggling to get medication that they might need. And nobody, a lot of people aren't really supporting these folks. And people wonder why a lot of people don't want to be really involved with activism like that. Because quite frankly, a lot of times there's no benefit in it. You have people who put their necks out there, people who are getting death threats, okay, and you get these trolls who get online talking this right wing BS. Like, I'm gonna end it because I'm starting to get agitated. But if you want to let me collect my thoughts. Let me tone it down. Do a few woosahs. Do some deep, breathe deeply, and if you want to read more of my writing, go to www.blackandintellectual.com. This live stream will be posted on my YouTube channel very shortly. Like this video, retweet it, and subscribe on my YouTube channel. Opt into my email list on my blog. I'm trying to get this article up today. I didn't talk about it today on the live stream, and I'm probably not going to talk about it on the live stream, but I will be writing an article about a few different topics that have come up over the past week. You'll see those topics on Black and Intellectual over the next few days. So just be on the lookout for that. And just have a good day, and hug your family, hug your relatives, because hug your loved ones, because tomorrow really isn't promised for anybody, and that's as real as I can be. And I know people know that already, but it needs to be repeated. Tomorrow is promised for no man, and that's all I wanted to say. That's all I wanted to talk about today, and just have a nice day. I will see you on Monday.